From the outside, Danielle Moore was everything a company could want in an employee. Sharp, reliable, articulate. She never missed a deadline, never raised her voice, and always wore that perfectly professional smile. At Holloway & Sons, a powerful, multi-generational private firm specializing in corporate branding and crisis management, she had worked her way up from receptionist to internal communications manager in just 4 years. She wasn't flashy, and she certainly wasn't the loudest voice in the room. But her talent for storytelling, for weaving narratives that made even the dullest quarterly report feel like a cause for celebration, had earned her more than a few unofficial titles. The Golden Voice, Brand Whisperer, Ms. Holloway. She chuckled whenever she heard them whispered in the hallway, if only they knew. Danielle kept to herself mostly. She was friendly, but not friends with anyone. She attended the mandatory happy hours, laughed at the right times, and always left before things got messy. She carried a black leather notebook with her everywhere, jotting down ideas, quotes, reminders, but also keeping track of things most wouldn't think to record. Dates, names, odd phrases she overheard, because somewhere along the line, Danielle had learned that the most dangerous people were the ones who smiled the hardest. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she first noticed it. She had just returned from lunch, grilled chicken salad, the same as always, and opened her email. At first, everything seemed normal, but then she clicked on a draft she'd been working on for the CEO's upcoming internal announcement. The tone was different, subtle, but off. The phrasing was a little too polished, the messaging a little too aggressive, and worst of all, her name wasn't on it anymore. She blinked. Maybe she saved the wrong version? She checked the document history. Nope. Her name had been removed, replaced with compiled by executive communications. A vague term they only used when someone high up wanted to take credit for something they didn't write. Danielle sat back slowly, her fork hovering above the half-eaten salad. She clicked into the metadata. The last editor, P. Wexler, Philip Wexler, head of corporate communications, her boss's boss. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. At first, she tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he just needed to standardize the message. But over the next few weeks, similar incidents kept happening. Her slide decks were merged into broader reports. Her language in press releases was tweaked without acknowledgement. She was asked to step back from presenting at the annual leadership summit, something she had prepared 6 weeks for, because it would be better optics if someone more senior delivered the message. Danielle knew exactly what was happening. They were taking her voice, her ideas, and her labor and erasing her name from all of it. Still, she said nothing. Not at first. Not yet. Instead, she started saving copies, versions, emails. She printed out her own drafts and mailed them to a P.O. box she had opened in college just in case. She backed up her files onto encrypted drives and changed her passwords. Then she noticed something even more disturbing. Someone had accessed her personal email. She'd received a notification from her Gmail account about a suspicious login from a Holloway IP address. When she asked IT, they brushed her off, probably just a system sync error, but Danielle knew better. She had never, not once, opened her Gmail on the Holloway network. That night, she drove to a coffee shop 20 miles away and opened her backup laptop. Every file, every note, she started locking it down. Something told her she was being watched. The confirmation came 2 weeks later. Danielle stayed late to finish editing a last-minute crisis memo, one that needed to be softened before being sent to clients after a junior executive had been caught on camera yelling at waitstaff during a luxury retreat. The office was quiet, humming only with the sound of printers and the occasional ding of the elevator. She was about to leave when she heard voices 2 floors down just outside the boardroom. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but when she heard her name, she froze behind the stairwell door. "Moore's getting too comfortable, too visible," said a male voice she recognized, Philip Wexler. Another voice, softer but colder. "She's too smart. We need to silence her before the next audit." Danielle's blood ran cold. Audit? That explained the rushed memos, the erased credits, the access to her emails. She waited until the voices faded before slipping out of the building, heart hammering. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she showed up at work wearing a red blazer, a bold choice in the land of gray and navy. Her makeup was sharp, her heels just a little higher. She smiled at everyone, greeted Philip like nothing had happened, sent emails, attended meetings, played the part, but behind the scenes, she was moving. Danielle began looking into the company's internal documentation, slowly and subtly. As internal comms manager, she had limited access, but enough to raise questions. especially around one campaign from the previous quarter. Hearts in Action, a supposedly charitable initiative boasting that Holloway had donated over $5 million to various nonprofits. Danielle knew something about that campaign didn't add up. For starters, she'd been asked to write the press release without ever seeing documentation of where the money had gone. She dug deeper. What she found made her stomach turn. Half the donations were made to shell organizations with names like Hope Circle LLC and Unity Forward. A few didn't even have websites. One listed its address as a strip mall in Nevada next to a pawn shop. Worse, the bank transaction logs she could access showed internal fund transfers labeled PR adjustments. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved just days before the campaign was announced. Danielle sat in her car after work, staring at the files on her flash drive. She knew what this meant. They were faking philanthropic activity, embezzling, laundering, branding it as generosity. She thought of calling the SEC, of sending everything anonymously. But part of her, perhaps the part that had always stayed quiet to survive, held her back. That night, she received a call from Marcus Chen, one of the only coworkers she genuinely liked. "Hey," he said, voice low, "you okay?" "Yeah," she lied. "Why?" "Just be careful," he said. "I overheard something. Wexler and Diana from HR were talking about a compliance concern. Your name came up." Danielle's hand tightened on the phone. "Thanks for the heads up." There was silence, then Marcus added, "If you ever need help, I know a guy. Discreet." She didn't ask who, just said thank you. Later that night, she opened a fresh page in her notebook and wrote 5 words in bold ink. If they want war, fine. She would let them think she was weak, quiet, afraid. But Danielle Moore had been underestimated her whole life. And this time, she was done playing nice. The day after she made her silent declaration of war, Danielle Moore walked into Holloway & Sons with the same practiced smile she'd worn for years. But behind her eyes was a different fire. She'd spent the night backing up files, encrypting data, and researching whistleblower protection laws. She wasn't ready to expose them yet, but she was getting close. She needed more proof, more time, more allies, and she needed to stay invisible while she got it. That morning, she emailed HR with a request for a role audit. It was a standard protocol for reevaluating one's responsibilities versus title, something employees could request once per year. But really, she was testing them. She wanted to see how quickly her request would be blocked or buried. An hour later, she received a reply from Diana in HR. "We're currently experiencing high volume. Please allow 6 to 8 weeks for a response." 6 to 8 weeks? Holloway's HR prided itself on 72-hour turnarounds. Danielle had her first answer. They were stalling her. By lunch, she was in the archives room. Most people didn't even know the archives still existed. It was a dusty, badge-access-only storage room 2 floors beneath the main offices, filled with filing cabinets, old PR packages, and financial documents from years past. Danielle had secured permission by offering to help digitize old initiatives for a legacy branding project. It sounded just legitimate enough to get a badge extension. She worked in silence, methodically flipping through files until she found a dusty set of folders labeled Hearts in Action 2022. She scanned each page, taking pictures discreetly with a pen-shaped camera she'd ordered online. Most of the files were standard: donation reports, PR plans, thank you letters from partner organizations. But as she dug deeper, things began to unravel. One folder contained a signed agreement with a nonprofit called Hope Circle Foundation. Danielle had never heard of them. She Googled the name and found a site with stock images, no staff bios, and a broken donation link. The address listed was in Nevada. She opened Google Street View and dropped the pin. The image loaded, a decrepit plaza, half the windows boarded up. The unit number listed for Hope Circle sat between a vape shop and a payday loan business. She felt her heart sink. Back in the folder, she found a deposit slip, $500,000 wired to Hope Circle, approved by A. Holloway. Andrew Holloway, CEO. That was the moment the shift became irreversible. Danielle wasn't just suspicious anymore. She knew, and now they'd destroy her if they found out how much she'd uncovered. She backed out of the archives carefully, locked the door behind her, and uploaded every image to her private cloud. That night, she re-encrypted her drive with 3 layers of password protection and set up auto-delete protocols in case of unauthorized access. Then, she got the call. It was Marcus. He sounded out of breath. "Danielle, you need to see this." She met him at a quiet bar near the train station. Marcus slid into the booth across from her, eyes scanning the room. I was cleaning the printer queue today, he whispered. The shared one on 27. She nodded. There was a deleted print job from Wexler's office. He forgot to clear the cache. I pulled the file. He slid a folded paper across the table. She opened it. It was an email, drafted but never sent. From Philip Wexler to Diana Hill, HR, Andrew Holloway. Subject: Internal Risk Strategy. We may need to address the Moore situation before external auditors arrive. If she pushes forward, we leak the past. Use the incident from NYU. If that doesn't work, terminate on grounds of insubordination. Full package ready. Legals on board. Danielle's hand trembled slightly. She folded the paper again, tucking it into her bag. They're planning to ruin me, she said, her voice low. Marcus nodded. But now you have it in writing. She looked up at him, brows furrowed. How did they find out about NYU? He hesitated. There's more, he said, swallowing. I heard Diana talking to someone on the phone. They hired a private firm, dug into your college records, medical history. Danielle's throat tightened. That's illegal. They don't care, Marcus said, and they're betting you won't go public. They're betting you're still scared. Danielle sat back in the booth, exhaling slowly. She hadn't thought about NYU in years, about that night, the night that broke her in a way she'd never admitted to anyone. Back in her dorm room, senior year, after the attack, she'd called no one. She went to the clinic alone, paid in cash, told no one. The only person who knew was the counselor she saw once, who never returned her second call. And now they were going to use that pain against her. Marcus reached across the table, voice firm. You don't owe them your silence. Not anymore. Back at home, Danielle barely held herself together. She turned on the shower, sat on the floor, and cried silently. Not just for herself, for every woman who'd ever been cornered, discredited, destroyed for speaking up. She thought of the younger interns she mentored, the emails she'd received over the years from other women asking how to grow in a system designed to keep them small. And then she got the email, no subject line, no signature, just a single sentence. Stop now or the truth about your past goes public. Danielle stared at the screen, numb. The timestamp was 2:14 a.m. The sender was anonymous, routed through an IP cloaker. They were trying to break her quietly. She stood up, walked to her closet, and pulled out the red blazer again. The next morning, she walked straight to the office of Diana Hill. I want to file a formal retaliation complaint, Danielle said evenly. Diana blinked. Against who? Wexler, Holloway, and you. Diana gave a tight smile. You're upset. Why don't we schedule a mediation with your manager? I'm not asking, Danielle interrupted. I'm documenting. Diana opened her mouth to protest, but Danielle dropped a flash drive on the desk. This contains audio, metadata, and emails proving internal misconduct, embezzlement, and harassment. You now have 48 hours to act internally, or I take this to the Department of Labor and the media. Diana paled. You're bluffing. Danielle leaned forward. Try me. That afternoon, Marcus was fired, just like that. No warning, no explanation. Security walked him out. Danielle watched from the fifth-floor window, fists clenched. They were sending a message. She got home that night to find a courier envelope on her doorstep. No return address. Inside, a printed article draft with the headline, Model Employee or Manipulative Liar. Holloway Insider faces mental health allegations. Her photo was attached, an old one from her college ID. The article referenced unconfirmed reports of a breakdown during her senior year, a suspected termination from a student role, and erratic behavior flagged by former classmates. Danielle dropped the page. They were really going to do it, use everything she had survived as a weapon. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the floor, then picked up her phone and dialed. Lena Cruz? She asked when the line connected. This is her, a calm, curious voice answered. I think I have a story you'll want to hear, Danielle said, and I'm ready to tell it, all of it. Danielle hadn't said the name NYU out loud in almost a decade. She hadn't needed to. The past was supposed to stay behind her, like the heavy boxes you tape shut and shove to the back of the closet, hoping no one will ever look inside. But Holloway and Sons hadn't just opened the box. They were shaking its contents into the light, eager, ruthless, and cold. Her call with journalist Lena Cruz had been brief, but decisive. Lena hadn't asked for proof, yet. She simply said, meet me tomorrow at 8 p.m., corner of 7th and Pierce. come alone, and bring everything. Danielle spent that day in a blur. Her mind looped through images of old dorms, cheap clinics, a gray waiting room with fluorescent lights that buzzed too loud. She remembered the receptionist's eyes, tired, kind, and distant. And she remembered the questions on the form, date of last period. Have you told the father? Do you feel safe? She'd checked no for all of it. She was 21, smart, independent, and completely unprepared for what had happened. The attack had come from someone she thought was safe, a fellow classmate, a guy everyone liked. And when she went to the university counseling office 2 days later, they told her that since there was no formal police report, there was nothing they could do. You should try to move forward, the counselor said, voice syrupy. Focus on your future. So she did. She buried it, switched majors, graduated early, and she swore she'd never let anyone use that night to define her. Until now. Shepherd, when Danielle walked into the dimly lit cafe that night, Lena was already there. She looked exactly as Danielle imagined. Jeans, combat boots, sharp eyes, a laptop open, recorder beside her cup. You really brought everything? Lena asked softly. Danielle pulled out the flash drive, the photos, the email printouts, the memo from Marcus, and the blurry screenshots of bank transactions. Lena whistled low. That's enough to start a war. I think they're trying to start one first, Danielle murmured. Lena leaned in. You know they'll come for you, right? Hard, publicly. If you go forward. They already are, Danielle interrupted. I got a draft article delivered to my house, talking about my past, my mental health, that event. Lena didn't ask for details. She didn't push. Instead, she nodded. Then they're scared. Danielle met her gaze. So how do we do this? We leak it at the industry conference, Lena said. You're registered to attend. You're still on the schedule as one of the internal panelists, right? Danielle hesitated. I was removed, quietly. Lena smirked. Good, that means they'll think you're not a threat anymore. She explained the plan. While Andrew Holloway gave his keynote on corporate responsibility in a new era, the screen behind him would be hijacked with the footage, slides, and emails Danielle had gathered. Lena would stream it, Danielle would narrate it, and the world would hear her truth. I want to tell my story too, Danielle said, voice firm. Not just about the company, about everything, about why I stayed quiet, what they tried to use against me. Lena paused. You sure? Danielle nodded. They already tried to break me with it. If I say it first, they can't. The next few days were the most dangerous game Danielle had ever played. She returned to work with a calm, detached smile. She laughed at hollow jokes in the break room, shared feedback on Wexler's new messaging campaign, and accepted an invitation to a team happy hour she had no intention of attending. All the while, she was syncing more files, editing voiceovers, and building a secret folder labeled Final Truth. She met with Lena 3 more times, always in a new cafe, always wiping her phone afterward. Marcus remained unreachable. She heard from a friend that he'd moved in with his sister in Seattle and was keeping his head down. She hoped he was safe. On the morning of the conference, Danielle woke up before dawn. She sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything pressing against her ribs like bricks stacked inside her chest. Then she stood, dressed carefully. Black suit, red blouse, clean lines. She clipped her Holloway badge to her lapel and walked into the fire. The industry conference was held in a 5-star downtown hotel, with chandeliers the size of boats and a stage draped in navy and gold banners. Danielle arrived early. Her job technically was to assist the communications team with setup, but she'd handed that role off weeks ago. No one questioned her presence. She walked the perimeter, noting exits, angles, the screens. Her hands were steady, her heart was not. At 9:47 a.m., Elena texted, "Stream loaded, we go at 10:02, be ready." At 10 o'clock, Andrew Holloway stepped onto the stage. The crowd applauded. Danielle slipped into the back row, seating herself just beside the audio tech booth. She nodded to the technician, who didn't know she'd already bribed his assistant to switch the feeds at 10:02. Holloway began to speak. Today, more than ever, corporations must be the ethical backbone of society. Danielle's jaw clenched. At 10:01, she stood up, walked slowly to the technician's booth, and nodded. The feed cut. Holloway stammered mid-sentence as the massive LED screen behind him turned black. Then, Danielle's voice filled the room. My name is Danielle Moore. I've worked at Holloway & Sons for 6 years. I was loyal. I believed in our mission. Until I saw what was behind the curtain. Images flashed. Emails, bank statements, internal memos with phrases like misdirection fund, press shielding, strategic CSR fraud. Then the audio. Just blame it on Danielle. No one will believe her anyway. Philip Wexler's voice, clear as day. Gasps erupted. Danielle's narration continued. They erased my name from reports, falsified my work, accessed my personal medical history to discredit me. And when I tried to speak, they threatened to leak a trauma I never consented to share. Then came the final slide. This is the truth. Use it. Silence. A long, thick silence, then chaos. Andrew Holloway's face had gone white. Wexler, seated beside the stage, jumped to his feet, shouting something unintelligible. Security rushed toward the booth, but Lena was already gone. Danielle turned and walked out through the back exit. She didn't run. She walked tall. The next morning, her face was everywhere. Whistleblower shocks. Corporate world with explosive conference reveal. Holloway and Sons accused of fraud, harassment, and retaliation. Meet Danielle Moore, the woman who took down Goliath. She received over 2,000 messages in 24 hours. Some praised her, some begged her for help, some called her a liar, a disgrace, a woman scorned. But the loudest voice was her own, and that changed everything. That's so. On the third day, Holloway and Sons filed a civil suit against her for breach of confidentiality, unauthorized access, and defamation. Danielle stared at the notice in her inbox, unmoved. She called Lena. We expected this, Lena said. I'll connect you with our legal team. And then, almost like a whisper, you did it, Danielle. You told the world. Danielle exhaled, but the battle was just beginning. The lawsuit wasn't a surprise. It was a declaration. Danielle received the official court notice via email and by courier. Holloway and Sons weren't just trying to silence her. They wanted to crush her. The document listed 8 counts: breach of contract, defamation, misappropriation of confidential data, reputational damage, and more. The damages sought totaled $18 million. Danielle sat in her apartment, the thick packet of legal jargon spread across her dining table. Somewhere between the third and fourth page, her hands stopped shaking. 18 million, she muttered, laughing quietly. That's how much the truth costs now. Her phone rang. It was Lena. You good? The journalist asked gently. Danielle sighed. I'm being sued for more than I've made in my entire life. I figured, Lena replied, which is why I've already connected you with legal counsel. Her name is Meredith Shaw. She's a monster in heels and on our side. Ciao. Danielle met Meredith the next day. She was everything Danielle wasn't. Tall, blonde, diamond sharp. But her eyes were kind, and her first words were, they're bluffing, and they're about to regret it. Meredith laid it out plainly. Yes, Holloway and Sons had money. Yes, they had power. But now they had public scrutiny. Their internal documents were being reviewed by multiple federal agencies. Several nonprofits listed in their campaign had publicly distanced themselves within 48 hours of the leak. And Meredith had more good news. Marcus just reached out. He wants to testify. Danielle's heart lifted. He's ready to speak. And he's not the only one. Apparently, Lena's story had ignited something. Several former employees, most of them women, had contacted her with similar allegations: credit theft, intimidation, discrimination, gaslighting. Danielle wasn't alone. Still, Holloway and Sons weren't backing down. They launched a PR campaign of their own: glossy ads, sponsored interviews, press statements claiming Danielle had manipulated confidential data for personal vengeance. They called her unstable, unreliable, and emotionally compromised due to past trauma. But Danielle had already told her truth, and now that it was out there, they couldn't use it against her. Instead, they looked desperate, and the world could smell it. 2 weeks later, the preliminary hearing took place. Danielle walked into the courtroom in the same red blazer she'd worn on the day it all began. Meredith walked beside her, calm and lethal. The Holloway legal team arrived in suits so expensive they looked custom-grown. At their center sat Andrew Holloway, stoic, tight-jawed. Philip Wexler wasn't present. Rumor had it he'd taken a sudden medical leave. Meredith leaned over and whispered, "Translation, they're throwing him under the bus first." The judge called the room to order. Holloway's lawyers started with a polished monologue filled with phrases like breach of fiduciary trust, malicious intent, and gross violation of ethical standards. When it was Danielle's turn, Meredith didn't give a speech. She simply played the audio recording. Just blame it on Danielle. No one will believe her anyway. The room went still. Then she followed with a signed memo from Holloway authorizing $600,000 in redirected philanthropic funding to a defunct LLC. Danielle watched Andrew Holloway's jaw twitch. Meredith turned to the judge. Your Honor, we welcome discovery, which meant, if you want to keep pushing this, we'll subpoena every document, every email, every secret you've tried to bury. The judge didn't dismiss the case, yet, but he issued a stay on damages and opened an inquiry into Holloway's financial practices. Outside the courthouse, Danielle was swarmed by reporters. A mic was shoved in her face. Danielle, do you regret going public? She looked into the camera. I regret staying silent for so long. That night, she received a call from an unknown number, a woman's voice. Danielle, this is Vanessa. I interned in HR 2 summers ago. I saw what they did to your file. I think I have something you need. Danielle closed her eyes. You're safe to talk now. We have legal counsel. You're not alone. The storm was growing, but so was her army. 2 weeks after the hearing, Lena dropped part 2 of the exposé. Titled How Corporations Weaponize Women's Silence, it featured Danielle's full testimony, interviews with 4 other former employees, and internal documents detailing over a decade of intimidation tactics inside Holloway & Sons. The article went viral within hours. Major investors began pulling out. The board called an emergency meeting, and 3 days later, it happened. Andrew Holloway resigned. No press conference, no farewell statement, just a one-line announcement buried in a Friday afternoon email blast. Mr. Holloway will be stepping down, effective immediately, to focus on personal matters. Wexler was never seen in the company again. Diana Hill's LinkedIn quietly changed to seeking new opportunities. And Holloway & Sons' stock price dropped 17% in 1 week. Danielle watched it unfold not with glee, but with quiet relief. They weren't ruined, but they were exposed, and they would never hurt another woman like her again. But there was one more thing Danielle needed to do. She emailed Lena. I'm ready, she wrote, to speak, on stage, to everyone. Lena replied instantly, TED Talk is yours, I'll make the call. The auditorium was packed. Hundreds of people filled the red velvet seats, the lights dimming, the stage glowing with that familiar white and red logo. TEDx Women's Salary Chicago. Danielle stood behind the curtain, her notes in hand, heart pounding. A producer tapped her shoulder. You're up in 30. She nodded, exhaling slowly. Behind her, the screen displayed her title. They tried to break me quietly, so I let the world hear me. And beneath that, a quote. Silence protects the powerful, but truth liberates the rest of us. When she stepped onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause. She waited, then began. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not on this stage, not in the news, not in any room where power was meant to be shared. Because the system I worked in was designed to reward silence and punish truth. But I chose differently. She spoke for 18 minutes, about NYU, about the trauma, about how Holloway tried to exploit it, about the fear of speaking up, about Marcus, about Lena, about what it means to be believed finally after years of doubt. She ended with, they tried to erase me, but I wrote myself back in. And now, no one else gets to tell my story. I chose me. She walked off the stage to a standing ovation, tears in her eyes, and more strength than she'd ever known. The standing ovation still echoed in Danielle's ears when she stepped off the stage. Backstage, Lena was waiting. Her arms wrapped Danielle in a tight, breathless hug. You did it, she whispered. That was lightning in a bottle. But Danielle wasn't celebrating yet. The TED Talk had gone viral overnight. Within 24 hours, it had surpassed 5 million views. News outlets re-aired segments, Twitter exploded with hashtags like Danielle speaks and silence is over. Influential women across industries, CEOs, activists, celebrities, began sharing her words with personal messages of solidarity. Danielle's inbox overflowed with requests, podcast interviews, corporate panels, book deals. She turned most of them down. She wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing justice. And justice wasn't finished yet. Behind the scenes, Holloway & Sons was unraveling. Meredith kept Danielle updated with the headlines the public didn't see. Federal regulators had launched a full-scale investigation into the company's financial practices. Whistleblower protections had been activated. Former employees were finally coming forward. And then came the final blow. Lena called her at 6:30 a.m. one Friday morning, her voice breathless. "We got it," she said. "Danielle, we got the smoking gun." A former junior accountant had come forward, anonymous for now. He'd leaked a full data dump from the company's internal server. Emails, spreadsheets, off-the-record directives, including one from Andrew Holloway himself, dated just 3 weeks before Danielle's leak. Subject line, redirect funds before Q2 audit. Body, use the third-party LLC, adjust narrative to align with CSR campaign. Be sure Moore's name is scrubbed from all files moving forward. There it was, in black and white, proof of theft, of fraud, of deliberate erasure. Meredith, ever the tactician, filed a motion with the court to add this new evidence. The judge granted a full discovery expansion. Now, Holloway and Sons was required to turn over every internal communication relating to Danielle, Marcus, and the Hearts in Action initiative. Danielle sat across from Meredith at her firm's glass-walled office that afternoon, the city buzzing below them. "We could settle," Meredith said carefully. "They'd probably offer something high, 7 figures maybe. NDA." Silence forever. Danielle stared out the window for a long moment, then turned. "No." Meredith blinked. "You're sure?" Danielle nodded. "I didn't do all of this to walk away quiet again. They wanted to break me behind closed doors. I want the verdict in front of the world." Meredith smiled slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that." The trial date was set for the following month. The media labeled it Moore v. Holloway, the trial that shook corporate America. Day 1 was chaos. Protesters and supporters lined the courthouse steps. Reporters jostled for photos. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Andrew Holloway sat at the defendant's table, still smug, still polished, but paler now, smaller somehow. Danielle wore no red this time. She wore white, pure, unapologetic, unshakable. The prosecution began with the leaked memo. The defense argued it was taken out of context. Then Meredith stood. She projected Danielle's original slide deck onto the courtroom monitor, then the altered version credited to executive comms. The difference was undeniable. She played audio of Philip Wexler and Diana Hill planning her silencing. And then Danielle took the stand. The room fell still as she walked up, raised her hand, and swore to tell the truth. "What was your role at Holloway and Sons?" Meredith asked gently. "I was the internal communications manager." "And were you aware of any misconduct?" "Yes." Danielle detailed everything: the stolen credit, the falsified donations, the intimidation, the anonymous threats. Then Meredith paused and asked the question Danielle had both dreaded and prepared for. "Ms. Moore, could you tell the court about what they tried to use against you?" Danielle nodded, and then she spoke, not just for herself, but for every woman who'd ever been broken by whispers in the dark. "When I was 21, I was assaulted by someone I trusted. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell anyone. I was scared and ashamed. I terminated the pregnancy quietly. I tried to heal. Years later, Holloway and Sons found out. They used it to threaten me into silence. They called me unstable, weak, but I'm not. I'm a survivor, and I'm still here." She ended with a voice that didn't waver. "They thought my past would destroy me, but I used it to burn down their lies." When Danielle stepped down, the courtroom was dead silent. Even the judge looked shaken. Meredith brought forward 5 more witnesses: former employees, accountants, interns. Each one told a different piece of the same story: a culture of intimidation, misogyny, fraud, and fear. By the time the trial closed, the truth was undeniable. The verdict came 2 weeks later. Danielle sat in the courtroom holding Meredith's hand. The jury foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Danielle Moore." Murmurs rose, for damages in the amount of $11.2 million. Danielle didn't move. Not at first. Then she exhaled, closed her eyes, and smiled. The victory made headlines around the world, but Danielle didn't take the money and vanish. She did something bolder. She launched Voice Unbroken, a nonprofit legal support and storytelling initiative for whistleblowers, especially women of color, LGBTQ+ employees, and abuse survivors inside corporate systems. Lena joined as head of strategy. Marcus became director of operations. Their first event was hosted at the very hotel where Holloway had given his infamous speech. This time, the screen behind them lit up with Danielle's words. You don't have to be silent, and you don't have to be alone. But perhaps the most surprising moment came 3 months later. Danielle received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address. Inside, a single sentence. I failed to protect you. I'm sorry. You were always the strongest person in the room. It was unsigned. But she recognized the handwriting. It was from the counselor at NYU. She folded the note, slid it into her journal, and turned the page. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the world shifted around Danielle like aftershocks from a long-awaited earthquake. She had won. On paper, in court, in headlines. But the deeper victory, the one she hadn't expected, was how many people came forward in her wake. Emails flooded in. From whistleblowers in industries as far-flung as pharmaceuticals, education, media, and finance. From women, men, and non-binary folks who'd been silenced, gaslit, or threatened into submission. They said the same thing again and again. I thought I was the only one. But no one had to feel alone anymore. Voice Unbroken became more than a nonprofit. It became a movement. Danielle was featured on magazine covers, honored at advocacy awards, and invited to sit on national panels discussing workplace protections and corporate reform. Her TED Talk passed 20 million views within the first 2 months. The girl who once whispered her truth now stood at the center of a global conversation. Still, she wasn't finished. The federal case against Holloway & Sons was underway, and while the company scrambled to rebrand and restructure under interim leadership, Danielle focused on a different kind of justice, the kind that wasn't measured in dollars but in dignity. Meredith had called it the second courtroom battle, because despite the civil verdict, Holloway's legal team filed an appeal, and Danielle, she welcomed it. In the appeals court, Danielle testified again, but this time she wasn't the only voice that mattered. Marcus took the stand. His testimony was steady, damning, and deeply human. He described the night security walked him out, the moment he realized helping Danielle had cost him his career. They didn't fire me for breaking protocol, he said. They fired me for standing next to the truth. Then came Vanessa, the former intern who'd worked in HR. She presented internal notes, handwritten annotations, and an email from Diana Hill instructing the HR team to prepare a contingency plan in case more becomes a threat. When the defense objected, the judge overruled it. This is not a smear campaign, Meredith said firmly. It's a mirror. Then Lena took the stand, not as a journalist, but as a character witness. She recounted Danielle's fear, her restraint, her refusal to release any information that couldn't be independently verified. She didn't want revenge, Lena said. She wanted the truth, and she risked everything to give it to the world. But it was Danielle's closing testimony that silenced the room. She stepped up, looked every member of the appeals panel in the eye, and said, "Power without accountability becomes cruelty. And cruelty dressed up as leadership is what I faced every day at Holloway & Sons. They tried to make me the villain of my own story. But they failed. Because I never wanted to burn the building down. I just wanted them to stop locking the doors from the inside." The panel took less than a week to return a unanimous decision. Appeal denied. Verdict upheld. The judgment was final, and with it, Holloway & Sons fell. The company declared bankruptcy within 6 months, unable to recover from the collapse of investor confidence, regulatory fines, and mass resignations. Its assets were liquidated, and a new watchdog group was formed to monitor ethics and corporate philanthropy, one with Danielle on its advisory board. But even as the dust settled, Danielle's eyes were set on something larger. Cham. One afternoon, as she sat in the newly opened Voice Unbroken headquarters, a sunlit loft above a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, her phone buzzed with a call from someone unexpected. It was Olivia Banks, a sitting U.S. senator. "Danielle," the senator said warmly, "I've read everything. Your case, your movement, your courage. I want to meet. I think we can work together." 3 weeks later, Danielle stood beside the senator at a press conference announcing the introduction of the MORE Act, a bipartisan federal bill designed to strengthen whistleblower protections, fund mental health resources for survivors of corporate retaliation, and create a national fund for anonymous legal support. The moment was surreal. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes, and Danielle's face was beamed across the country, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as a leader. Later that night, after the press frenzy faded and the streets quieted, Danielle walked alone along the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, wind curling through her hair. She paused at a bench overlooking the skyline. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Can you believe where we are now?" She smiled, typing back. "I always believed. Just never thought it would hurt this much to get here." She. But the most unexpected moment of the year came weeks later when Danielle was invited to deliver the commencement address at NYU's graduation ceremony. She stood once again behind a podium, this time before thousands of graduating students. She didn't speak of pain or revenge, she spoke of voice. "When I sat in this audience over a decade ago," she said, "I thought the measure of strength was how much you could endure without breaking. But I've learned that true strength is breaking, loudly, fiercely, and with purpose. So the cracks let other people in, so the light can find you." She ended with a line that brought the audience to its feet. "They tried to erase my story, so I became the author of 1,000 others." As the ceremony ended and families reunited, a woman approached her quietly from the edge of the crowd, older, nervous, holding something small. Danielle turned and froze. It was her old counselor. "I don't expect forgiveness," the woman said, voice trembling, "but I wanted you to know. I've spent the last 10 years changing the way I do this job, because of what I didn't do for you." Danielle nodded. "Then you're already forgiven." She took the woman's hand and let go of one more piece of the past. It had been 1 year since Danielle Moore walked out of Holloway and Sons for the last time. 12 months since her voice, once only heard in memos and press kits, had echoed through courtrooms, auditoriums, and across millions of screens worldwide. Her life was no longer quiet, but it was finally hers. Voice Unbroken had grown beyond anything she imagined. What started as a modest organization supporting whistleblowers had evolved into a full-fledged movement, with legal clinics in 6 cities, a hotline that fielded thousands of calls a month, and an annual summit called the Truth Conference, where survivors, advocates, and reformers came together to turn pain into policy. Danielle no longer needed to work in the shadows. She stood at the forefront. At the summit's opening this year, she took the stage before 3,000 attendees. As she scanned the crowd, faces full of scars, strength, and survival, she knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. Her opening line? "They tried to bury me in silence, but all they did was plant me in purpose." The crowd roared. But the public work was only half of it. The private Danielle, the one who'd carried trauma folded deep inside her, had finally started to heal. She'd begun therapy, the real kind, not crisis management, not cleanup, but honest, painful, transformative work. And for the first time, she didn't apologize for needing it. She journaled again, not because she needed to track threats or document violations, but because she wanted to remember joy. She reconnected with her brother, Malcolm, who had been distant for years after leaving their complicated childhood behind. When he called to say, "I saw what you did. I'm proud of you," she cried so hard she couldn't speak. She allowed herself friendships that weren't transactional. She even began something new, something terrifying with Lena. It had started slowly. An after-interview drink turned into long phone calls, into shared silence, into late-night confessions. Danielle had once thought no one could love the broken parts of her. But Lena never flinched. Not when Danielle froze in the middle of a dinner date because of a song that triggered a memory. Not when she admitted how scared she still felt walking alone at night. Not when she said, "Sometimes I still feel like that scared 21-year-old in the clinic lobby." Lena just squeezed her hand and replied, "And you're still here. That makes you stronger than anyone I know." One morning, Danielle received a thick envelope in the mail. It was from the Department of Justice. Inside an official letter, "We are pleased to inform you that your testimony and evidence were integral in the successful prosecution of Holloway and Sons. As a result, federal reform guidelines for corporate philanthropic practices have been introduced, effective immediately." She stared at the page for a long time, and then she laughed. Out loud. Free. She thought back to her first day at Holloway years ago, nervous, overqualified, overlooked. She remembered the break room smiles that masked ambition, the way her credit slowly disappeared from projects, the sting of being told to let someone else present, the gut punch of hearing her trauma turned into a threat. She remembered how small she used to make herself, how polite, how silent, how survivable, and she promised herself, never again. To celebrate the DOJ win, Lena surprised her with a weekend getaway. No press, no phones. Just them. They went to a cabin in the woods, miles from any boardroom, courtroom, or newsroom. There was a lake, a hammock, a stack of books, and a journal Danielle hadn't dared open in months. On the last night, they built a fire and made s'mores. Danielle stared into the flames. I used to think healing meant getting back to who I was before, she whispered. But maybe it's becoming someone stronger because of what I survived. Lena leaned her head on Danielle's shoulder. Maybe it's both. When they returned, Danielle was invited to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Forum. The panel was titled Voices That Change the System. She shared the stage with global activists, lawmakers, and survivors from every continent. And when it was her turn, she stood behind the podium, cleared her throat, and began. I'm not special because I spoke up. I'm standing here because thousands of others couldn't, or weren't believed, or didn't survive it. So I tell the truth for them, loudly, boldly, repeatedly. Because the people who tried to destroy me didn't fail because they weren't powerful. They failed because I stopped being afraid of them. She paused. The room held its breath. They tried to break me quietly, so I let the whole world hear the truth. And the world did hear it, loud and clear. In her apartment that night, Danielle lit a single candle. It was her ritual now. Once a month, she sat in silence for 15 minutes. Not in grief, but in gratitude. Gratitude for Marcus, for Meredith, for Lena, gratitude for the girls she used to be and the woman she became. She pulled out her journal. The last page was blank. At the top, she wrote in bold, steady ink, I chose me. And then she began to write a new story, one no one would ever steal from her again. The end. Reflection, lesson learned. Danielle's journey reminds us of a truth too often whispered. Silence is never neutral. In systems built on hierarchy, fear, and exploitation, silence protects abusers and isolates survivors. But when that silence is broken, when someone like Danielle speaks up, it has the power to ignite change far beyond any boardroom or courtroom. Her story is not just about taking down a corrupt company. It's about reclaiming voice, agency, and truth in a world that often punishes those who dare to challenge power. It's about transforming pain into purpose and becoming stronger not despite the scars, but because of them. Real healing isn't neat. It's messy, nonlinear, and deeply personal. But it begins the moment we choose ourselves, our dignity, our voice, over fear, shame, or silence. To anyone out there who's been gaslit, silenced, or made to feel small, your story matters. And when you're ready, the world needs to hear it. Because telling the truth won't always be easy, but it will always be worth it.